Hello, my loves, and welcome back to after a slight hiatus because I had to actually go and read this book. It's an odd one. This is one of the ones that I've read the least. I'll be honest, and it's one of the ones that I was least familiar with. This is book 9, Mechanicum. Now, Mechanicum is notable on a number of levels. First of all, as the name implies, it is the first of the Horus Heresy books that does not specifically explore the background of a Space Marine Legion as they were back then. This breaks the format of the Horus Heresy books up until this point. Every single book up until this point is focused specifically on one of the Space Marine Legions, specifically one of the Traitor Legions, and has sort of charted their descent into heresy and madness and insanity. This book is different on a number of levels. Again, written by Graham McNeill, one of my favourite of the Black Library writers. Mechanicum actually shifts focus quite dramatically, not only in terms of its subject, but in terms of its location. This is the first of the books that is set in the Sol system and is very, very close to Terra, because, of course, most of the action takes place on Mars. Mars being the homeworld of what is, at this point, not the Adeptus Mechanicus. It hasn't become the Adeptus Mechanicus yet. It is the Mechanicum. And the Mechanicum, or the Adeptus Mechanicus as they will become, it's interesting because they've always been a key part of the background. Ever since the very beginning, they've always been a key part of the background, but they've only been part of the background, and much of their imagery, much of their ethos has been, up until this point, just implied in little details. Like, you get references to the Adeptus Mechanicus in, like, Tech Marine entries in the codices. You get little references to them when they're talking about who fabricates the technology for the Imperium. That's essentially what the Mechanicum is. It's a cult of humanity, of humanity, I suppose, which has grown up on Mars and is kind of removed from the ethos and the philosophy of the rest of the Imperium, in the sense that it doesn't necessarily share the rest of the Imperium's philosophies or goals. It just sees them as useful. Not only that, but it is one of the very, very, very few heavily divergent human cultures that is allowed to sustain beyond the remit of the Imperium and of the Great Crusade. The Mechanicum worship, I suppose worship is the wrong word, but they revere a sort of abstraction of technology called the Omniscia, who they believe is the motive force of all technology, is sort of like the god of technology, I suppose. And their entire philosophy revolves around upgrading humanity. It's about updating humanity. They explore technology and they don't care about consequence or morality or anything like that. They don't really have any notion of that. There are actually, and one of the interesting things that this book brings up is Mars is a big planet and the Mechanicum is huge. It's not just one organization. It's lots of different subcults and churches and temples that are sort of loosely cohered under the remit of a fabricator general who controls operations on Mars and kind of sanctions what is sanctioned and denies what is considered forbidden. Beyond that, there's not much. Their entire remit is the exploration of technology, finding STC constructs and templates, trying to further humanity through technology to the point whereby they do away with their own humanity. I mean, that's what's so interesting about the Mechanicum. One would think, given the Great Crusade's overarching ethos of humanity being the perfect form, being the ideal entity within the universe, which is what the Great Crusade promotes, that humanity is somehow like the apex of evolution, and that it is the species that rightfully will conquer the universe and will dominate beyond all of the alien species that have gone before or after. But the fact that the Mechanicum actually deny their own humanity, they actually see weakness in it. Their entire ethos is about upgrading the human, upgrading the flesh with metal and with technology, and a lot of them have done that. A lot of them are not even remotely human anymore. They are more alien than alien. They are actually these bizarre, either reptilian or insectile or serpentine machine entities that don't even think in human terms anymore. They think in terms of cold logic, in terms of whatever engrams remain, whatever programs they have seething through their various computational centers. They've upgraded their minds as well as their bodies, so they've got like tertiary nodes and things all over their bodies and computational spheres that are way in advance of anything a normal human brain is capable of. Part of the ethos of some of the subcults on Mars is doing away with humanity. They actually regard it as something weak and grotesque and disgusting, whereas others, they seek to marry a perfect balance between the human and the machine, and it just depends on what temple they derive from or what philosophy they happen to promote. And what this book explores is the mounting tensions on Mars. We're very close to terror at this point, and very early on in the Horus Heresy. So it is known at this point that Horus has rebelled and that there is a war brewing, a civil war brewing in the Imperium. And what you're having on Mars are these not conflicts just yet, but discussions, I suppose, considerations. There are forces and factions on Mars that are logically deciding where they should go, whom they should side with in this conflict. And then you have characters who are aghast that they're even having this conversation. Characters like the main character, the protagonist of this piece, who is largely forgettable, it has to be said. One of the weaknesses of this book is that, and one of the reasons I had to go back and read it again, is that it's kind of sedate, because it is all set up. The book is almost entirely set up. It is not the conflict in and of itself. It's a sort of giant first chapter or a giant prologue. It is establishing. And there's a lot to do here, of course, because up until this point, I mean, as I said before, there was not a great deal of information on the Mechanicum or the Adeptus Mechanicus as it would become. Everything was surface detail. So really, Graham McNeill was writing everything from the ground up. He was creating and fabricating everything from the ground up, which takes a lot of doing. It's very hard to do in this kind of mythology. So a great deal of the book is simply establishing how these cultures work and how the Mechanicum operates, how day-to-day life on Mars is like. What is it like for a creature, for an entity that is part of these bizarre structures to go through their daily routines? Because it's not like it is on Earth. It's not like it is amongst the cultures of humanity. They're very different. They are very, very different indeed. They've removed themselves from humanity and have become almost alien, which again makes them odd. The only reason, I mean, you could look at it very cynically, and the cynicism is true. I mean, that's the true perspective to look at it in. The only reason the cults of the Omniscia and the Mechanicum have been allowed to sustain is because they benefit humanity. They're the ones that create all the starships, all the weaponry, all the armaments. They're the ones that oversee the creations of the Space Marine legions. So there's not much choice. There had to be some compromise there. But as some of the characters who are against the Imperium and sort of promoting to side with Horus point out, it's only a matter of time. When the Great Crusade really gets running, and when it has established itself, when it has actually conquered the universe, and when it has its own forge worlds and when it has taken the onus away from the cults of the Omniscia, then of course they may reconsider their perspectives in that regard, and they may start to regard them as heretical and as blasphemous, because they are perversions of humanity. And this is a very key point. I mean, the antagonist characters in this book, like Kelbor Hal, they have voices. They do have voices and reason here. They are not just like lunatic or monsters. They're not just warp tainted or demonically possessed or anything like that. They have reasons for doing what they're doing. And of course, one of the other reasons that's brought up, which is really interesting, you have the roots of the Dark Mechanicum here, which of course we now see in the present day 40k. What Kelbor Hal and his factions promote is that what Horus promises is a freedom of exploration within the remit, with outside the traditional remits of both Mars and the Imperium. So now they will be free to experiment beyond the bounds of physical reality and beyond any limit of technology that has ever been known, because of course that's what chaos allows for, that's what chaos provides, and they've been given examples of that. There's something now that has become key to the background, because it's part of the background for the demon engines, for the Lord's Discordant, for the obliterators and the mutilators, the notion of scrap code. There is this notion in the Mechanicum book, which is new, it's actually introduced here, of sort of tainted computer programs, so AIs and computer programs that are tainted by the warp, that actually are written in the language of demons and of the warp, and which, when they infest systems, they transform them not only on a virtual or digital level, but on a physical level as well. They open them up to new states of being, new states of operation within chaos, within the embrace of chaos. As Kelbor Hall points out, they are the Mechanicum, or the Dark Mechanicum, is capable of things that the traditional Mechanicum could never dream of, or the Mechanicum within the Imperium could never ever dream of. And that's very interesting. You actually get to see like the antecedents of the obliterators here. You get suggestions of where the obliterators might have come from, but also other things like demon engines and whatnot. There are lots of subtle little suggestions and mysteries in this book, but very little that's stated outright. Very little that's stated outright. And eventually it does erupt into outright conflict and war. You know, Kelbor Hall and his lot actually make a play for Mars itself, and they win. As we know from the history, they actually do take Mars. Mars comes under the control of Horus at some point, but it's insidious, you know, it's subtle. It's not like all-out war where they can see from terror what's happening. It's not until much later that it's revealed to the Imperium that Mars is under chaos control. But yeah, it's an interesting book. There's lots of ambient detail about the culture of Mars, the nature of the Mechanicum, how it relates to the Emperor and to the Imperium itself, which is really interesting. Some on Mars regard the Emperor as an incarnation of the Omnicia, or as an aspect of the Omnicia. Some don't. Some have sincere doubts about that. And that's true on both sides, actually. They are keenly aware that they are in a political relationship with the Imperium, and that's really interesting. That's absolutely fascinating. And they sort of discuss and embrace the ambiguities of it. I like that, and I love the details where you get to see how Mars works as a culture. That's really interesting too. There's also, it does this thing that the Horus Heresy books always do, which is they drop mysteries into the established background. So you get, at certain points in this book, discussions of the past history of Mars and what it was like before the Emperor came. There is a suggestion in this book that there is something, well, there's an outright statement that there is something sealed under the surface of Mars that the Emperor fought and sealed down there. It's some sort of entity that he couldn't destroy, and it's suggested that it's the Void Dragon, which is a Catan, meaning that potentially a Catan, an ancient star god, has been influencing the Mechanicum and the Adeptus Mechanica since the very beginning. It's hard to say because a lot of it is vague illusion and mythology. It's very, very difficult to say one way or another. It's very cleverly done. A lot of it is stated, or a lot of it is alluded to rather than stated. It's back mythology. It's history that's so ancient it has become fairy tale or become folklore. So not many who exist now on Mars actually know the exact history, and that's fascinating. There's also these suggestions that throughout Mars, like littering the surface and sort of burrowing through underneath, are these ancient forbidden chambers and caverns that have never been accessed before, that have been sealed away for generations, that have alien weapons in them, ancient Xenos artifacts, warp artifacts, forbidden technology, which of course the servants of chaos want to unearth. They actually want to make use of and explore, because they haven't been allowed to up to this point. There's an interesting philosophical discussion that goes on here for the Mechanicum. Which way do they turn that's better for them? Which way do they turn that suits them and not the Imperium? And that's the conflict. That's the conflict. It's those that are loyal to the Imperium, who have kind of swallowed the Kool-Aid of Imperial conditioning and propaganda, and those that want to free themselves from the shackles of it through chaos, through the corruptions of chaos. It's interesting. It's a bit, one of the problems with the book is it's a little inert because it is just a setup book. It's not really a story in and of itself. That kind of erupts in later volumes. It's slightly inert. It's slightly forgettable at times. It's a book of suggestions and of ambient background rather than one of the full-flown narratives that you get in later books. But that doesn't mean that it's weak, it's just different. It's different, and it does take some getting through, unlike some of the others. It's a very, very interesting piece of work, and very different from the ones we've had before. It's refreshing in that regard, because it does have some interesting details that are necessary to know. You need to know this to understand what happens later, so it has to happen. We need to know what's going on Mars, for example. The politics of Mars is key to what happens later on, when the invasion of Terra and the Sol system actually happens. So, yeah, it's an interesting one. You have to read it if you're going to read the Horus Heresy series from beginning to end, unfortunately. It's not one that you can just miss out, like Battle for the Abyss, but it does have its merits. It is not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, and it's a bit too big for its britches. It feels like an opening chapter prolonged into a novel or extended into a novel. There's maybe too little narrative and plot and sort of too much fluff, too much filler here, but still an interesting piece and well worth checking out. I don't know what the next one is, ladies and gents, but next time we'll be moving on to book 10. So, until then, bye-bye!